Hello, this is Stephen. This is the Bureau of Lost Culture. She says, I was reared Catholic but got over it. Was born male but got over it. Stopped sleeping with boys around the time I stopped being one. And I'm much happier than I was when I was younger. She's a poet, a novelist, a writer of science fiction, a reviewer, a cultural critic, a literary journalist, and of course a celebrated activist. She's been a sex worker, a hustler, as she would say. She's been both celebrated and denigrated. She was born a boy in 1949 and became a woman all the way back in 1982. ROZ Kaveny is very good fun, and as you're going to find out, has had quite a life, a very countercultural life indeed. Now, I don't normally do trigger warnings, in fact I don't think I've ever done a trigger warning, because I think we're all grown up right, but there are some things around sexual abuse in this episode that you may want to be aware of in advance, and some frank details of Roz's surgery. But before we dive in, as this is the last episode of 2024, I want to say thank you so much to everybody who's written in this year. I really appreciate the suggestions and, of course, the kind words and the support. Some people have been very generous. Bless you. Keep it coming. If you haven't been here before, you can check out all that we do at bureauoflostculture.com, and you can make suggestions for who you would like to hear from or about in 2025. But let us get on with it, as I welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture, ROZ Kaveny. The legend. Welcome to the Bureau, Roz.
The whole legend stroke icon stroke thing really still freaks me out.
Accept it.
It's been a long trip to get here.
It is a long trip, so we should set off quite quickly.
Okay.
Now, I know that you're sort of London born and bred, right?
Hammersmith Hospital, which of course is East Acton, White City, next to the Scrubs, where my father worked.
Wormwood Scrubs with the prison. Yeah. Your dad worked in the prison, did he?
Yeah, Wormwood Scrubs, and then later on Wakefield.
For listeners who are not from London, the Scrubs, Wormwood Scrubs, is one of the oldest and most infamous prisons in the city of the West, right?
And I grew up on the prison estate on...
So that was like an estate, a group of houses which were around the prison for the people who worked in the prison?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
I went to East Acton County Infants and then to John Perrin County Primary. And then I got a scholarship to the school at Ealing Abbey, St Benedict, where I was for 3 years. And then we moved up to the north of England, went to school in Leeds.
So that was the Wakefield prison. And just to put this in a temporal context, 9th of July, 1949, you were born.
Yeah. I moved up to Leeds 63, so took an extra year to do my A-levels a second time, and then got a scholarship to Oxford.
So you're a brainy kid then?
I was quite bright, yeah. But also having a lot of problems already in my teens. I had what we now call gender issues when I was really quite young, but the friend I confided in at the age of 5 supposedly died when we were both 7, and that was a huge trauma. Didn't think about anything connected with her for years. When I was 12, 13, 14, about the time I moved to Leeds, I started to realise that I hated being a boy, wanted not to be a boy, and spent the next couple of years doing a lot of research on what that might mean, which is one of the reasons why in the sixth form I messed up my A-levels the first time.
Let's fill this out a bit, because you said, I was reared Catholic but got over it. I was born male but got over it. Stopped sleeping with boys about the time I stopped being one. Let's talk about that, because, I mean, you said at your age 5, and we're talking about here about 1954, right? Yeah. 1954, 1955. So do you remember, or, can you remember what it was that made you feel different?
I had actually forgotten this period till she re-emerged in my life about 7 years ago. I was told she died.
So this is a person that you thought disappeared, basically, but actually then turns up in your life 6 years ago and says, I'm alive.
I mean, I said, how did you find me? She said, well, you told me you were a girl when we were both 6. And so I looked for a grown-up trans person with who might be you.
Wow.
And she found me.
Now that is interesting, because kids say all sorts of things at that age, right?
Yeah. As a grown-up, she'd been a teacher.
Right.
She'd had trans pupils.
Right.
We were the 2 really bright kids in the school. I mean, like the school actually had people from the Department of Education come and interview us kind of thing when we were 7.
Sort of prodigies.
Yeah, we were supposed to be some kind of prodigy, which just goes to show how silly that idea is.
Well, you've been prodigious in some ways.
Well, in some ways.
Yeah, but I mean, forgive me for asking, but it's just that, I know, maybe it's lost in your memory anyway, but it's just that, what does it mean, you know?
Mostly it was feeling like not a boy, as much as feeling like being a girl. I was stuck in a class with boys, and I was going through the degree of puberty I ever went through, which wasn't total.
How old were you then?
14 going on 15.
In those years between that sort of 6-year-old and you and the 14-year-old you, do you remember much?
I was very lonely. At the junior school, they segregated us at break, and I spent those 4 years talking to my close girlfriends through the wire that separated the two playgrounds.
Right.
Because I wasn't interested in hanging out with boys.
Did you get some stick from the boys?
Of course I did. The only reason I didn't get bullied was that I was always very tall, which meant that eventually bullies would push me too far. I had a nightmarish first year in Leeds when I was doing O-levels, horrifically bullied by pretty much my entire class, physically brutalised for an entire year.
And psychologically?
And physically and psychologically, until I completely lost it and actually hurt someone a bit. And the school turned a blind eye to that, as the school had to everything else. And then we were all in the sixth form, and we suddenly all pretended none of it had ever happened.
So you said that when 14 was when it kicked off, but puberty is, starting. But
all of the boys I was at school with knew that in some way I wasn't one of them. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I was bullied. It was partly being a southern ponce with a different accent. It was partly being camp as anything. When I talk about being bullied at my school in London, the major bully was the headmaster of the middle school, who was a prodigious sexual abuser, as it later turned out. But I and my best friend, who were the two scholarship kids, were also the two queer kids, and he didn't fancy us, so he beat us a lot.
Oh, God.
It was a flogging school. He'd find all sorts of weird reasons to beat me. He didn't like my handwriting. 6 straps across the buttocks. Someone stole a book from my desk and it turned up in a classroom I didn't use on the floor. 6 across the buttocks for losing the book, 6 across the buttocks for untidiness.
Perverted sadist, basically.
Yeah.
But because you were different, because you were other, didn't actually do a directly sexual abuse.
Yeah, I mean, it turns out he was the jocks.
What does that mean?
The sporty kids.
Okay, he went for the sporty kids.
Yeah.
Right.
And I and my best friend actually tried to kill him.
How?
Well, we noticed he was always brushing against the wall at the bottom of the playground with his crappy old car. So we spent months removing a little bit of mortar from between the bricks every day.
With the hope that the wall would collapse on his car.
Which it did.
What?
We were in an exam and the wall fell over on his car.
No, he wasn't in it, I presume.
He was in the car, but it didn't hurt him.
Right.
But nobody ever suspected anything.
Right. Okay, so that was all at middle school in London.
Yeah.
And then we flipped back to Leeds.
I went off and did all the basic research.
Let's dig into this a bit. So you're only 16 still, so we're talking here only like 65. So the counterculture's kicking off.
I was one of the kids who bought the Velvet Underground and Nico album, but didn't start a band.
You were aware that like something was going on in the culture, were you?
Well, I mean, because I was a science fiction reader,
right.
And so I was reading New Worlds.
Yeah, Michael Moorcock.
And Science Fantasy magazine. We're reading a lot of Mike Moorcock's work there. Yeah. Mechanism for staying sane when I was being bullied.
You could escape into his worlds.
Yeah.
Right. There's music, there's Moorcock, there's something going on.
And there's comics. I mean, and specifically because I was buying cheap science fiction magazines and comics, I was hanging out in a lot of slightly dodgy newsagents where I was able to find all sorts of stuff about being trans.
So it's 1965-66. What is there out there about being trans?
There's a lot of imported soft porn exploitation autobiographies, magazines about people working in New York nightclubs, and I sneak peeks at those. Because obviously I'd assumed originally that I was just gay, read a lot of gay literature, and this is a story a lot of trans women of my generation will say. I read City of Night, which is John Ritchie's novel about the hustler subculture, and there's a trans or pre-trans character in that called Miss Destiny. And I went, oh.
Up to then you were thinking, okay, I'm attracted to boys rather than girls, so maybe I'm gay, which at that time would be difficult enough, right? Because we're talking about the pre-legalisation and the victimisation that you get anyway. And then you read this book, a light bulb goes off. Was that it?
That's it, exactly it.
Right.
It's possible to become a girl, or a reasonable facsimile thereof. Then find the trans community in Manchester. There were a couple of drag queens in Wakefield and Leeds pubs.
I'm surprised to hear that.
There was a thing. This is the period of Danny LaRue having a nightclub.
Okay, right.
There's a gayish pub in Wakefield that has a drag queen singer. I got to know him and I asked him, do you know any trans people? And he knew a bunch of post-operative trans women living in Manchester. And I started lying to my parents about where I was at weekends, saying I was staying over with friends doing study, and hitchhiking to Manchester and hanging out with trans women in their 20s and 30s.
These are people, post-op people.
Yeah, there was briefly a gender identity clinic in Manchester in that period. And I met Ava and Sylvia and Karen and a couple of others who'd had their surgery. They let me hang out with them.
In terms of the operation, when was the first one that was done in this country then?
Late 40s.
Okay.
But you also got various people going to France, working in Parisian nightclubs, like April Ashley.
April Ashley is...
And in the 60s, she starts modelling on this side of the channel and gets outed as trans. In, 68, 69, her rich husband gets the marriage annulled rather than pay her alimony.
Because he didn't know?
Of course he knew.
Yeah.
He was a chaser.
What's a chaser?
A guy who has a fetish for trans. And this leads to the Home Office under Jim Callaghan deciding to de-recognise trans identity, which previously had been sort of shoved under the carpet.
So it was kind of not fully acknowledged, but it wasn't repressed in any way.
Yeah,
but
basically it was the late 60s, a marriage that had been conducted knowing that woman was trans, gets annulled on the grounds that it can't have been a proper marriage because she was trans. And the Home Office decides to endorse that. Whereas previously, trans identity was sort of unofficially accepted.
So basically they're saying, no, this is not a woman. It was never a woman, so therefore the marriage has been annulled.
And that remains the position until the Gender Recognition Act. The women I knew in Manchester were terribly responsible. I go out with them cross-dressed, hang out in Canal Street pubs. They said, do not try and run away and live with us because you need to go to university. You can have a better life if you just wait to do anything. And of course, one thing that happened around then was I got stopped by a cop car, and because the cop had clocked me.
As a boy dressed as a girl?
Yeah. He threatened to arrest me, threatened to tell my parents.
On what basis?
Walking while trans. Conduct liable to cause a breach of the peace.
Okay, right, yeah.
Soliciting for sex, whatever. And basically he forced me to have sex with him in the back of his car as the price of not being arrested. For my own good, because if I go on doing this sort of thing, this is the sort of thing you can expect.
So he knows that you're a boy dressed as a girl.
Yeah.
But there's no problem with him having sex with you in the back of the car.
No.
Jesus.
There is an awful lot of really weird doublethink about these things.
Yeah.
The first of 3 rapes.
How did that make you feel? What did you do about it?
Well, nothing. I mean, it's just, I was quite glad not to have been arrested and have my parents find out.
So it was a full rape?
He made me give him a blowjob.
At that time, you were just like a relieved not to be arrested. Your parents don't find out. But you were going out. You were able to all go out together to places dressed as a girl, as a woman.
And have fun and just hang out. I mean, I wasn't a wildly sexual person. They were mostly hustlers, having sex for money, because that was the only work they could get. Doing a bit of hairdressing in a couple of cases, but they weren't having great lives, Frank. And then I just went off to Oxford. When Oxford got unendurable, as it periodically did, I'd hitch up to Manchester.
To be with them again.
Hang out with them again.
That must have been an enormous relief to be able to be with your tribe, as it were.
Yeah.
But also, I guess, until just be able to find out more about what this meant.
Yeah.
And the possibilities and the potential.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Okay.
But mostly I'm also just concentrating on being at Oxford, trying to be a poet, trying to be an academic, spending time in London doing countercultural things but not trans things. I saw the Rocky Horror show during its first run with the original cast, kind of thing. Go to a couple of Bowie concerts.
Were you sort of then also starting to connect into, your tribe, as it were, here?
My connection with my tribe, as it were, in London happens in late 71 after I've done finals.
Did you have a romantic life during that time?
I mean, I was very confused. I mean, I wasn't having sex, partly because I'd been slightly traumatised by the rape. I had romantic crushes on straight boys and a couple of lesbian women, and was very confused about that. I didn't get a first, got a job. But as script reader and script librarian at the now long-defunct Yorkshire Television. In 71, while I was regularly hitching to London to work in the British Library, I made contact with the Gay Liberation Front, met Rachel Pollock, who had just started what we now call the trans group within the Gay Liberation Front, TVTS Drag Queen Caucus. The meeting with Rachel was one of the key events in my life. I helped her run the group. In 72, we wrote Don't Call Me Mr. You Fucking Beast, the trans manifesto, which was published in 1972, and is an important historic document for people who claimed that trans people weren't around at that time.
Here is a sidebar with selections from Don't Call Me Mr. You Fucking Beast, the Trans Manifesto. The transvestite, transsexual and drag queen group has been meeting for several weeks. So far, about 40 people have called or visited. Some have come regularly, some have drifted off. Almost all have been women, people born males who live as women, or more commonly dress as women, whenever they get the chance. Transvestite men, people born female who live or dress as men, have so far not come forth. We're working to break down these barriers. But for now, this article will be the experience of transvestite women. Not an article really, just some notes of things we've learnt talking to each other. How many of us are there? Nobody knows, or has any real statistics, but there are 60,000 people in the United Kingdom taking sex hormones. Add to this the people who want them but the doctors won't give them to, the people who want them but are afraid to ask, and all the transvestites who, at the moment, aren't interested in hormones. The amazing thing is, most of us think we're a tiny minority. One transvestite thought she was the only person in the world who did this strange thing, until she saw the movie Psycho, in which the detective uses the word transvestite, and she thought, there's a word for it. When we're alone, we tend to accept the stereotypes. By getting together, we've discovered how ridiculous they really are. No one in the group has ever said, what horrible trick of nature has made me a woman trapped in a man's body? We just don't think that way. The psychiatrists who electroshock us think we're pathetic or tragic, but even those who are very much in the closet enjoy being transvestite as long as there's some outlet. We don't follow any single profession. Recently, a Gay Liberation Front brother said he thought most transvestites were upper class and in the art world. At one meeting we had, among others, there was a student, a house cleaner, an office worker, an engineer, a prostitute, a pub entertainer, and a taxi driver. Most of all, were not heavily rouged, teased-haired parodies of anybody's traditional role. Some of us dress that way, why not? Some regular women dress that way. But we're just people, and our taste covers the whole spectrum, from middle-aged matron to hot pants to maxi skirt, even to butch. A similar question, perhaps even more immediate, is the question of passing. Transvestites have always sought to pass off as regular women by disguising their voice, walking right, etc. Certainly it's a thrill to have a salesgirl say, "Can I help you, madam?" But do we give up too much? How can we escape the feeling of being just an illusion? Something that can't be touched or looked at too closely? And we become so paranoid when we're worried whether people will read us. Also, one transsexual said, "You don't become the woman you are, but the woman you can pass as." Which means you may feel like maxi skirts and scarlet capes, but you wear brown middies so people notice you less. So many sex changes live in constant fear people will discover their pasts. One sex change said she's torn between two desires. One to disappear and be accepted as a regular woman after struggling for so many years. The other to shout up and down the street how beautiful it is to be transsexual. If you're young and haven't suffered as much, you're quick to say, "Be militant, don't hide." Those who came out long ago are often the proudest because they've been themselves the longest. But they also know that if you pass, you're treated as a human being. If you don't, you're treated as a pervert or a roadshow. Yet, there are also thrills to not passing, or more precisely, not caring if you pass. You dress, comb your hair, use makeup to suit yourself, not to go unnoticed. And you discover yourself developing street instincts, how to handle crowds, how to judge people approaching you, what to do about police. One sister always carries an Italian women's magazine on the tube, so if someone speaks to her, she can wave the magazine and pretend she doesn't speak English. You learn to laugh at people before they laugh at you. You become your own street theatre. Two transvestites can conquer a whole department store of uptight straight people. Certainly, one thing becomes more and more clear as we come together. Pass or not pass, we can't let anybody tell us what we are.
For a while, everyone was cool with us. And then there started to be some gay male liberationists started to have issues about trans people, and some lesbian feminists started to have issues with trans people. A lot never did. There was always a dispute about this. But around that time, in late 72, early 73, when I'd started taking hormones, I thought I'd get myself on the path to medical transition before I transitioned socially, because...
When and how did you decide to take that step? And how did you go about doing it?
I found a slightly dodgy doctor who'd prescribed me hormones.
That was the only way to do it?
I didn't want to go to Charing Cross yet.
What was happening at Charing Cross?
Charing Cross had a gender identity clinic, but John Randall, who was the psychiatrist there, was a notorious disciplinarian with strong views about how people ought to be and look and act and work. And I didn't want to go through that route until I had to. So I got black market hormones, started to take them, at which point some of my feminist friends were concerned about this and went and talked to eminent feminist academics who summoned me to their presence and gave me a serious talking to about how being trans was a false consciousness and I should not transition.
What did they think was the thing to do then?
Oh, try and reform masculinity from the inside.
Reform masculinity from the inside?
I swallowed this for several years.
Right.
Stopped taking hormones, remained friends with Rachel, who respected my decision.
What effect did the hormones have on you?
I started to go breasts. Always had huge, non-boy-like nipples. I never had any body hair. When I say my puberty was partial, I mean there were things that were anomalous. And I did respond quite well to hormones fairly instantly, but I stopped.
I want to hear a bit more about your life in London. Where were you living? How were you dressing?
There was this period where I was still living in Oxford, being involved in the Gay Action Group in London, cross-dressing a lot, coming to London, staying with Rachel, living as a girl when I was staying with Rachel, but then going to the British Library as a boy to do my research.
And where did you hang out? Where was it safe to go out dressed as a girl?
Notting Hill. It's where Rachel and Edie lived, and I was staying with them. It was 1972. You've no idea how stoned we all were all the time.
You were already a big smoker, were you?
I was when I was hanging out with Rachel.
So when you actually moved to London, where did you move to?
First of all, to West Ken, working part-time behind the bar at the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, occasionally cross-dressed.
By the way, listeners, if you don't know the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, it's an institution, let's put it that way. It's been recognised as the most important gay venue in London.
A friend had just come down from Oxford and we took spare rooms in a flat in the West End which belonged to an exiled Stalinist Estonian sculptor. And we lived there for several months and then we got a house in Islington. And then I left that a couple of years later to share with a straight boy I was desperately in love with, who didn't know I was desperately in love with him. And
he knew you were cross-dressing, right?
Yeah, and but it was complicated because this was the point at which I was seeing a couple of men that I knew, that I'd met through GLF, occasionally for sex. I was also having my one heterosexual relationship with a close woman friend who had decided to save me.
From transitioning? From
boys.
Right.
And it was a real relationship. It taught me a lot about myself. This was the point at which gender incongruence kicked into gender dysphoria. It wasn't that I couldn't function sexually as a boy. It was I really hated doing so.
Right.
And by this point, I'd done the civil service exam, briefly had a very promising career in the civil service, managed to screw that up by being arrogant. While that's going on, I'm still in the straight relationship with her and a gay relationship with a guy who was quite into me, cross-dressing. One of my best friends dies of cancer. Literally 2 days before she dies, she summons me and tells me to stop fucking myself up.
Meaning what?
She said, "You're utterly miserable. You're making everyone around you miserable. Stop doing it. Transition already."
Right.
And I promised her on her deathbed that I would sort myself out. So I started to do that.
What did that mean?
Going to my GP, he sent me to Christy Brown at the Maudsley, who after a while okayed me for hormones. I was already taking them. After a while, put me on the list for surgery. Tried to get another therapist. She introduced me to my friend, who I will call Natasha, who was a young American who was living over here studying and was going back to Chicago, and encouraged me to follow her back to Chicago.
You're on the list for the surgery. You've got the hormone treatment officially this time.
Yeah.
Okay. You've got to wait a certain period of time before the surgery, right?
They would let you start medical transition before you did social transition.
Meaning what's...
By the time I was prepared to live as a woman, I had softer skin, had electrolysis on my vestigial facial hair, was starting to develop breasts.
But had they given you a time span here?
Waiting lists were a lot shorter back then. I was fairly fast-tracked. I mean, I started seeing Christy 77. I had my surgery at the end of 82.
In anticipating that, looking forward to this, let's get on with it, or was this some anxiety?
Frankly, I was wanted to be done with having a dick. I'd come to hate it because I had this bad habit of falling in love with unavailable straight boys. I kind of thought, well, that will help. But basically, I just wanted to have my proper life.
But you meet Natasha. Natasha says, "Hey, come over to Chicago," right?
Yeah.
Natasha, also trans. Yeah.
Her argument was, you need an existential break.
Great.
You're too comfortable.
Great argument.
Yeah.
So you got on a plane and went to Chicago.
The first thing that happened was, by the time I got to Chicago after a brief stay in New York, hanging out in bars, picked up a couple of boys, quite good sex, got the Greyhound to Chicago, at which point Natasha goes, "I've been rethinking this whole idea of you living with me." Another of her proteges had just fucked her boyfriend, and she was slightly off the protege thing. Said, "Get a hotel room, you'll find bar work or do some hustling, you'll be fine." Which I was for a while, but then I got raped by a guy with fake police ID.
What happened?
He showed fake police ID, got into my room and then pulled a knife. It's exactly what happens in the novel. Tiny pieces of skull.
For listeners, Tiny Pieces of Skull is ROZ's novel about trans hustlers in Chicago.
I mean, that whole scene is exactly what happened. I mean, all of the stuff about me distracting him with tarot cards and then beating the crap out of him after he'd raped me is what happened.
How did that affect you and what happened? You know, what did you do about it?
Well, it was very traumatic. And if I hadn't had the splinter of ice at the heart of the true artist, I probably wouldn't have coped as well.
What does that mean?
Well, it meant that while it was happening, I was going, this is awful. I don't know whether I'm going to survive this, but I will use it if I do. One day I will write all this down.
Which you did.
Which I did.
You didn't take any legal action?
No. I did ring the bar he'd followed me from and tell them about him. And they said, oh, that's why a couple of people have been beaten up lately. Describe the guy. And I don't know if anything happened to him, but since the mob ran the bar, I assumed that they may well have done. I didn't ask. Came back to London, got on with my life, had my boobs done, transitioned socially definitively, summer of 79. Mid-1980, Natasha writes to me and says, oh my God, I really fucked up. I really shouldn't have let you down the way I did. If I pay for your flight, will you come back to Chicago? So I did. I'm a trusting soul. But actually, I had a great time in Chicago the second time. We were working together as call girls.
Oh, this is your life as a sex worker?
First time I was doing sex work out of bars and hustling. The second time I was in a much more upmarket bracket.
So sex work out of bars, how does that work?
You basically hang out in bars. People know it's a bar where trans sex workers hang out. There are various communities, mostly ethnic, sitting at different tables. Guys who want that kind of trade will come and sit at your table and say, hi. And you'll say, hi. And they'll say, do you fancy a drink? And I'll say, yeah, do us a drink. And after a bit, they'll say, do you have a place to go where it could be more quiet? And you go, depends. What were you thinking about? And you have to make them say that they want sex and are prepared to pay for it, because otherwise they could be cops. But the cops aren't allowed to entrap you. So you're careful and you're cagey, and there's this weird sort of little dance that goes on.
You go off somewhere quiet?
Yeah, you go back to your hotel room with them.
Hustling is...
doing the same thing on the street.
Sounds risky.
Which is risky.
Did you enjoy it?
It was what it was. It was boring like most jobs. It was sometimes unpleasant. It was sometimes less unpleasant than you'd think, because I quite enjoyed a lot of the sex and I quite enjoyed getting paid for it. And sometimes it was horrid.
Did you look very glamorous?
Well, the thing is, back then, I was young, thin and very, very cute. I became a fat old slag later on. When I first transitioned, I was a babe, and I really enjoyed that.
You said you had your boobs done. What was that? So what?
I mean, I'd really grown quite a lot from hormones, but I had implants, so I had quite big breasts. Yeah. The 1980 trip ended because Natasha's dreaded ex-boyfriend and she had terrible, terrible fight, which led to him sleeping with his Italian boss and calling the mob down on her.
It's a rollicking tale, this one, isn't it?
We literally left Chicago to escape the mob because Mr. Salvatore, Stephen's boss, let it be known on the street that there was a hit out on her. So we actually had 24 hours to get out of town. Came back here. She prospered and is now very grand and made a good marriage, as they say.
You came back, sort of ignited your London life.
Started working as a reviewer and publisher's reader. I had my surgery in late 82.
You've done the hormone treatment, you socially transitioned, the time has come. And how does it work? What happens?
I go into hospital. Basically, they construct a vagina using a lot of the flesh from my penis, using a nerve cluster from my penis to make a clitoris.
Here is a sidebar. A brief history of gender confirmation surgery, as sex change operations are now called in the United Kingdom. The earliest documented case of gender confirmation procedures in the UK emerged all the way back in the 30s, though they were generally performed then very rarely and in an experimental capacity. Most British individuals then seeking out such procedures had to travel to Europe, particularly to Germany and Denmark, where pioneers like Magnus Hirschfeld had established specialised clinics. The first known British physician to take a serious interest in gender identity was Michael Dillon, who himself underwent numerous pioneering surgical procedures between 1945 and 1949. His experience and medical training made him one of the first British doctors to advocate for the medical treatment of gender dysphoria. Roberta Cowell in 1951 became one of the first known British women to undergo vaginoplasty, creation of a vagina. That brought increased attention to the procedures, but access was still very difficult. Until 1966, when the Charing Cross Hospital in London, good old Charing Cross, established its gender identity clinic, which became the first National Health Service facility to provide care for transgender patients. The case of April Ashley, which ROZ mentions, significantly changed both the legal and the medical approach to, although initially, as ROZ mentioned, it resulted in restrictions rather than more rights. In the 70s, there was more integration of procedures into the NHS. The waiting lists, as ROZ mentioned, were extensive and access remained pretty difficult. But the medical procedures continued to advance and the surgical practices improved significantly from then onwards. And the 1990s marked more of a progressive era here in Britain. There was more sophisticated surgical techniques, more improved hormone therapies, better understanding of what people actually needed, and developments of pre- and post-operative care. The passage of the Gender Recognition Act in 2004 represented a big milestone because that meant that you could be legally recognised post-gender transition. And surgery is provided still through the NHS and through various private healthcare providers. It's obviously been quite controversial of late. The NHS offers a range of procedures including chest reconstruction, genital reconstruction, facial feminisation surgery, better understanding of nerve preservation and sensation, and enhanced aesthetic outcomes.
Unfortunately, I pick up some post-operative infections, so I have to patch over a period of months some of the interior of my neo-vagina with skin from my thighs.
So this must be quite painful.
You think? I had a couple of really bad post-operative infections, including one that caused a very major hemorrhage. In and out of hospital for 2 years, well into 85. I have a lot of urinary tract problems. I have a fistula. I have some major sores. At the same time, there are a couple of periods when that's not going on, and I go to Paris to visit friends and end up, while in Paris, having my one really good straight heterosexual fuck as a woman with a guy who picked me up in his restaurant.
What was that like?
It was great. It was terrific. It was everything I dreamed of. And yet somehow it no longer quite mattered to me.
Did he know?
We discussed it. Mm-hmm. He said, I like you new girls.
Were you supported through all these?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I had great support. Most of my friends were completely supportive, completely helpful. When I was sick.
One of the things that we haven't talked about, right the way back from, back to when you first decided to transition, how was your relationship with your family? What did they know? What did they think? And
they didn't know why I'd gone to America. When I socially transitioned, my sister took on the job of explaining things to my parents.
They had no idea before that?
Sort of vaguely assumed I was gay.
Had your relationship with them been good all through all this time?
Good, but incomprehending. Mm-hmm. They weren't happy about my transitioning, but at the same point, our relationship never stopped. They visited me in hospital. They were supportive. They bit the bullet on that one. They were amazingly good, actually. In 85, I started volunteering at the new London Lesbian and Gay Centre, got caught up in what we now refer to as the sex wars, because there was an attempt by some of the people on the board of the London Lesbian and Gay Centre to ban SM and bisexuals. Some of us organised a grassroots movement among the membership to protect the rights of SMers and bisexual people in the community. I got very involved with that on the grounds that, well, they haven't come after trans people, but that's only because there aren't many of us using the centre, and they will come after us sooner or later, so may as well
Get in there first.
get in first. As a result of that, having started to identify as lesbian, having started to be attracted to women, much more than I ever had been before, drifted into part of the SM subculture, discovered I quite enjoyed SM sex.
As an S&M, you'd made the move from actually being attracted to men to now being attracted to women.
People said, you went through all this trauma. I said, yeah. I said, didn't go through all that to be straight.
So you've gone from a boy to a girl and from fancying boys to fancying girls. It's complicated, yeah.
I still noticed boys as being attractive, but I no longer wanted to do it. After you've been raped 3 times, it kind of puts you off sex with boys.
You didn't mention the third time.
The third time, I was in Soho visiting friends, a lot of trans friends who worked in dubious clubs. A couple of large men took me by the shoulder and steered me into someone's office, club owner who'd seen me around and decided he wanted a blowjob from me. With 2 large men holding my shoulders, I didn't really have any options. He apparently did this quite a lot. Ages later, a lesbian friend met me for tea and had this terrible thing happen to her. And I go, oh, I know that guy. He did that to me a couple of years ago. I'm really sorry.
Did you do anything about it?
You jest, surely. I wrote a poem years later. You bank these things to experience. It is, as they say, the price of doing business. I did a little bit of escort work when I was in London, but not much. I didn't really need to. It was something I did when I was broke or couldn't get other work. But given I had other work, why would I need to? I had a lot of friends who were working in clip joints or who would do street hustling.
Your life as a woman post-op, despite all the operations and the problems and the medical issues and stuff, when you finally got there, did it feel like you were home?
Oh, yeah. Especially when I started getting laid. I'd been socially accepted for years at that point.
Did you start to have romances?
Yeah. A couple of very messed up on and off relationships. One thoroughly satisfactory, fairly cold-blooded fuck buddy relationship. And then I met my partner and lived happily ever after.
So you were also hanging out with the club scene in the 80s, weren't you, as well?
In 78, I and one of my best trans friends, whom I'd known from GLF and met again after she transitioned, hear that there's a new romantic club called Billy's, where a lot of the Soho kids go. We're late 20s. We go down to Billy's, meet, and I make friends with a bunch of people who are in their early 20s, about 5 years younger than us, are mostly working in clip joints and hustling. In several cases, in and out of jail. I end up, in 79, after I transitioned socially, living with a couple of gay men in a licensed squat. They both get permanent flats. I fill it up with a bunch of the Soho kids because I know them and they need somewhere to live. And that's a fairly short-lived period of the Dalston trans commune. Some of the people I met at Billy's, I was very vain and didn't wear my glasses. So have no idea who I met. At one point I met Boy George at one of the Portchester drag balls, actually, and he said, I know you. He said, I used to see you down at Billy's. I went, I'm really glad to know that, but I didn't think I knew you then. In 81, 82, I was hanging out with a lot of artists and fashionistas, but I don't remember that period terribly well because 25 General Anaesthetics in 2 years started working as a reviewer and publisher's reader. That's been my life ever since. I advise a number of publishers about manuscripts. I've discovered a couple of quite big names. I've recommended a lot of highly thought of novels. I wrote Tiny Pieces of Skull in 1988, but failed to sell it. I wrote some science fiction short stories in the early 90s, but then stopped writing for a bit because I was terribly busy politically.
You met your partner, who's still your partner. You've had a pretty, extraordinary career. You've, written for the big papers, cultural critic, academic writer, you transgender activist, of course, all the way through this. Novels, short stories.
Deputy Chair of Liberty.
Deputy Chair of Liberty, right? You've returned to poetry, inspired by the death of a friend, or the grief of the death of a friend, right? And you're still at it, right? At the age of 75, are you 75, right? I mean, you're a member of the Midnight Rose Collective with lots of other science fiction writers, founding member of Feminists Against Censorship. But when you look back at it all, what does it feel like?
It's what happened. When I was a teenager, 66, I read Margaret Drabble's Jerusalem the Golden, which is all about this girl from an impoverished northern background who gets to go to Cambridge and put her Yorkshire life behind her and be part of glamorous London media life. And I remember reading that and thinking, game plan. And it didn't work out quite as well as I'd have liked, but it worked out pretty well. I mean, that wonderful Max Beerbohm cartoon about Arnold Bennett, where the old, fat, prosperous Arnold Bennett is talking to the young, thin, weedy Arnold Bennett. Mm. The old Arnold Bennett says to the young Arnold Bennett, it all worked out according to plan. and the young Arnold Bennett goes, yes, my plan.
But if the 75-year-old ROZ Kavenny was speaking to the 16-year-old, 17-year-old ROZ...
Hang in there, it'll be okay. What I would also say is, I wouldn't have believed I could have this good a life and still be so perpetually broke.
Well, come on, you're a poet.
Yeah, I'm a poet.
What do you expect? I think we're going to have to end, but as we're on the subject of your writing, I think we should hear some poems.
Yes. This is from a sonnet sequence I wrote in 2012, but it feels staggeringly prophetic. You will not all live through this. Death will take you unexpectedly. Shot in a crowd, crossing police lines. And if I'm allowed, by circumstance and age, my heart will break. I'll write a poem for each death. My friend was special and is gone. That's what we say in every elegy. And then I may incite some sort of violence at the end. I'll still write sonnets. And that little turn in the last couplet will break people's hearts, read at your funeral. And so it starts, the people's angry rage. I see them burn your killers. Yet know with a guilty sigh it was my verses sent you out to die. London. Night in a city that has licked its wounds 2,000 years and curls around its kids, feeding and grooming heroes, cowards, wits, lovers and killers. All was quiet sounds as traffic purrs dim catlights in the street. Windows are dark in darkness, curtains drawn so many million. City, I was born in your warm heart, my first breath to its beat, and hope to die according to your laws, breathing your scented, passioned, poison air, surrounds me, chokes me, black dust in my hair. I drink dark milk protected by your claws, Gog, Magog, Bran, and dragons in the stone. You gave me all the words I write, breathe, own.
ROZ Kavenny, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. That's been great. I wish I had longer to talk about more stuff.
Thanks to ROZ for that very frank, entertaining, well, for me, educational and rather moving, at times shocking journey through her life. Some extraordinary things there, and of course she's still at it. Like many people, I suspect, I'm still finding my way when it comes to, let's call it, the gender issues. I'm not afraid to say that I find some of it very confusing, and I've been dismayed by the actions of extremists at both ends of the political, cultural spectrum. Hopefully it will settle down and become a more integrated part of our culture, not just the counterculture. And for those people who are suffering and have been through such difficult times with regard to their identity and gender, things will get easier. Thanks to Dan and to Rachel and to Adrian at Soho Radio for all that they do. Thanks to all my guests this year. Absolutely amazing. And thanks, of course, to you for listening. Let's keep listening. We've got new plans for the new year. Got a very special guest to start off 2025. But if you're listening to this in 24 December, happy Christmas, happy Hanukkah, solstice, or whatever you celebrate at this midwinter time in the Northern Hemisphere. And even the Southern Hemisphere, probably enjoying this from the beach. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing you further down the road, around the bend, and over the hillsides for more tales from the counterculture, from the underground, and from the other side. Let's finish with a tune. This is the Real Tuesday Wells, A Christmas Wish.
I wish we felt the way we did at Christmas time when we were kids, and the world seemed full of promises, she said. I said, sister, that's cheap sentiment, rose tinted rouge you used to pretend. You're happy now, you were a miserable cow back then. I wish you Christmas, though I don't know what that means. I wish you most of what you want and everything you need. every stone.